Hello, my name is Maggie Hartley, and I'm the Assistant Director of Public Engagement for the National World War II Museum. And thank you for joining us for tonight's webinar, From Soldiers to Civilians, Reflections on how the VA assisted veterans returning home from World War II. This program is a part of our 75th anniversary of the end of World War II commemoration that is generously sponsored by the Department of Defense. Now, you may not think of the VA as being a significant part of the end of World War II. However, its rapid expansion starting in 1944 with the GI Bill would impact over 12 million service members who would be returning home starting in 1945. The biggest question would be, how would the US care for these veterans who defeated the Axis powers? Of course, this question was forefront in FDR's minds, starting in 1943 to 1944, for how he would help reintroduce service members to the workforce. He would later sign the GI Bill on June 22nd, 1944, that would support housing and education benefits, along with unemployment insurance. Immediately following the end of the war, literally the day after the Japanese surrendered, President Harry Truman would appoint General Omar Bradley on August 15th, 1945, just 2 days before, this was the 76th anniversary of that, to oversee the Veterans Administration. He would be instrumental in expanding the health and medical access for veterans in his 2-year tenure to what we know today is the largest integrated healthcare system in the United States, providing care at over 1,200 healthcare facilities with 170 VA medical centers and over 1,000 outpatient sites of care. Now, to share more about this significant improvement to veterans' care and benefits immediately following World War II, we are joined today by historians from the Veterans Benefits and Health Administration.
Hello.
Hi.
Perfect. We're so glad to have you guys. Now, we have Dr. Jeffrey Sykin. Wow. Twisting my tongue a little bit there, the historian at the Veterans Benefits Administration, who will discuss the origins, impact, and legacy of the 1944 GI Bill, one of the most transformative pieces of social legislation in US history. The bill provided education and housing benefits to millions of returning veterans and helped ease their integration back into civilian life. And we also have Katie Della Sensory, who is the historian for the Veterans Health Administration, who will provide insights into the unprecedented changes that the VA made after the war and how it revolutionized medical care for veterans. She'll also reflect on the enduring legacy of the 75th anniversary of the modern era of VA medicine and the programs that were initiated during this time, many of which remain very much alive and present in the care of our nation's veterans today. So thank you for joining us today. Katie and Jeff.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you tonight. I can't say be there with you tonight, but at least to be present.
Yes, it's great to join you all, and thank you, Maggie, and thank you to the World War II Museum for having us.
Yeah,
absolutely. We're very excited to be able to talk about something that means so much to a lot of Americans, and really World War II helped to accelerate what we know today with veterans benefits. So before we jump into the questions that I have for y'all today, I would like to remind our audience that there will be time for questions and answers at the end of this program. So if you have any questions for our panelists, place them within the Q&A section on Zoom or as a comment on the Facebook video stream. I also do want to remind our audience that this program is designed to look at the rapid growth and impact of the Veterans Affairs System at the end of World War II. If you have any questions related to your eligibility and benefits, please contact your local VA. So for the first question, I'm going to toss it to you, Jeff. What sort of benefits did the government offer veterans of wars that came before World War II?
Okay, well, just kind of by way of a general introduction, as Maggie said, I'm the historian for the Veterans Benefits Administration. That's one of 3 administrations that form the VA, and the VBA is in charge of the different benefits programs given to veterans. And these are compensation, pension, veterans readiness and employment, which is offered to disabled veterans, help them get job training and placement, insurance, and then the two we'll be talking about today are education and loan guarantees. Now, the compensation and pension programs, those are the two earliest benefits that were offered to veterans, and those date back to the Revolutionary War era. And compensation was offered to service members who were injured during the war, and it was designed to sort of compensate them for their loss of earning ability. And then pensions were offered more generally to anyone who served during the American Revolution who was in need of financial support from the government. And the pension program came after the war, like about 30 or so years after the war, when the veterans were aging, while the compensation program was offered during the war. And those were the two oldest programs. And those remain the main benefit programs that the government offered to veterans really through the 19th century. And in World War I, it did introduce several new benefits programs. There was, for the first time, government offered subsidized insurance to service members in case of death or permanent disability. And after the war, they were given the option of converting that to kind of like term insurance. They offered vocational training and education for veterans who were disabled during the war to help train them so they could return to the workforce and resume productive lives. And they also offered extended medical care through a system of government-owned hospitals that were run first by the Public Health Services and then by the Veterans Bureau in the 1920s and later by the Veterans Administration. So those were the main benefits that were in place at the time of World War II. Now, World War I veterans, they felt like they kind of got a raw deal. In addition to the programs I mentioned, they were often also given $60 like a mustering out payment upon discharge, kind of like giving them some pocket money to help them make the adjustment. But during the war, due to the demand for labor, wages have been really high, and soldiers, by comparison, kind of missed out on that. They did not make nearly enough, and so they really felt like they didn't really get the same benefits as those who did not actually have to serve during the war. And so the American Legion, which was one of the largest of the veterans organizations that was formed after the war and had like about 800,000 members, really pushed Congress to make an additional payment for veterans. And in the 20s, a bonus bill was passed that offered them up to $600, depending on whether they served overseas or not. But there was a catch. They were just given a certificate that could not be redeemed for another 20 years, like in 1945. And then when the Great Depression hit and many veterans were thrown out of work, they did press Congress and press the government to allow them to redeem those certificates immediately. And when Congress and the president said no, about 20,000 veterans in 1932 marched on Washington, accompanied by about 15,000 family members to make their case. And when they were still rebuffed, several thousand remained they set up an encampment in Washington, on the banks of the Anacostia River to kind of put pressure on Congress. And after there was a clash between some veterans and some others that resulted in a few deaths, President Hoover decided to send in the army to evict these veterans. And it was just a complete disaster. The encampment burned down to the ground. The army was using tear gas. They sent in cavalry, even a few little tanks, and just dispersed the veterans. So it was a huge calamity. And memories of that kind of whole debacle was very fresh in people's minds when World War II came around, and they realized there'd be a mobilization of manpower on a scale that had never before seen. And so people were very worried about what was going to happen after the war, where there'd be more kinds of social unrest and high rates of veteran unemployment. And they'd also seen, in Germany and Russia, where disgruntled veterans had helped topple the governments. So they were very fearful of that going into the war.
Absolutely. It's really fascinating to see the background for the benefits and how they've evolved over the years before World War II. And I guess to kind of pose that question from the medical side, Katie, what are the origins of veterans healthcare in this country? What did veterans hospitals look like before World War II? And I guess to kind of build on what Jeff was saying, what were the unique needs of World War II veterans that kind of helped inspire what we know today?
So the origins of healthcare for veterans in our country can be traced back to the end of the Civil War in 1865 with the establishment of the National Home for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers, which was the first time that the nation provided health care to its veterans who are not enlisted officers. These were regular volunteer soldiers at the time. And so these homes were located in rural areas of the country, and they were kind of scattered out. There was one in Milwaukee, there was one in Dayton, there was one in Togus, Maine, and they provided medical and holistic care to the nation's veterans in a domiciliary setting. So that meant that the soldiers lived there, they had barracks, they had parade grounds, they had a hospital, they had recreational buildings, things like that. And it really was meant for this sort of lifelong care of veterans. And they were located in rural areas because they were on these larger tracts of land where land was cheap and they had plenty of fresh air, but they also were meant to keep the men away from temptations, as it were, sort of alcohol and gambling that you could be found in larger cities like that. So those are the origins of veterans healthcare in our country. And as you progress, that evolution continues as well. And so after World War I, you see that model kind of change in some ways. You don't have that lifelong care aspect. You have a more rehabilitative model where you seek to return veterans to society after their wounds are treated. But you also still have that kind of rural component as well. Remember, this is during the time of tuberculosis, Spanish flu has happened, a lot of respiratory diseases happened, or ailments happened with World War I. So again, you have these sort of more broad, spread out campuses with the second generation of veterans hospitals, as are known after the Second World War, to deal with those illnesses as well. And so that by the time, though, that World War II comes around, like Jeff was saying, this was a war on like any other scale in our history. And so you have 16 million veterans returning home from this war, and 500,000 of whom would need immediate medical care. And that's just due to advances in battlefield medicine. Being able to treat soldiers on the spot there meant that more soldiers were able to survive wounds that were previously not survivable before. So you have this sort of influx on a level that you'd never sort of seen before. So there needed to be a new system kind of in place to handle this greater influx of veterans.
That's interesting to think about. I guess I never really considered the fact that medicine had evolved so much by World War II that it did require a different approach to how we cared for vets. So I guess going back to Jeff, looking at benefits, why did American leaders decide the GI Bill was necessary? And then I guess to build on that, who authored it and what did it do for Americans?
Okay, well, as I was saying before, American leaders were fearful of a repeat of the large-scale unemployment they saw after World War I. They were worried about so many service members leaving service all at once would drive up unemployment rates and might even plunge the country back into a Great Depression. And they were also just worried that there'd be just tremendous social unrest and chaos on the streets. So to prevent this from happening, planning within the executive branch for the post-war era actually began before the US even entered the war in 1940, which is one of the things I do find amazing. And by 1942, Roosevelt had formed a demobilization planning committee to begin studying the problem, and he established a second committee to consider post-war educational opportunities for service personnel. And he presented his own vision for what the post-war demobilization would look like in one of his famed fireside chats in 1943, where he said that he wanted mustering out pay for veterans, unemployment benefits for veterans, and also some form of educational assistance. Now, at that time, leaders in both political parties and the leaders of the main veterans organizations like the American Legion, they were also beginning to try to craft their own solutions. So how do we handle the demobilization of 16 million people? And it was actually the American Legion which kind of took the lead. They formed a legislative committee And one of the members of the committee, Harry Commemorating, who was a World War II veteran and lawyer and prominent Republican, he famously drafted a sketch of what did become the GI Bill on some pieces of hotel stationery. And initially, a member of the American Legion dubbed it the Bill of Rights for G.I. Joe and G.I. Jane. That was shortened to the GI Bill of Rights, which is real catchy. And the American Legion launched kind of a publicity tour to drum up support for their bill. And then the bill was presented to Roosevelt, was introduced into Congress. And eventually, with a lot of changes, it was molded into what became the GI Bill we know today. And its official name was the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. And that kind of tells you all what the bill is designed to do, to help people readjust to civilian life. And there are just 4 main provisions to the bill. There is $500 million for construction of hospitals and other facilities for veterans, which Katie, I'm sure, can talk about. There's unemployment compensation for veterans. They're eligible to receive $20 a week for up to 52 weeks. And they could also draw on the services of the U.S. Employment Service to help them with job placement. They're provided with education and training up to 4 years. The government would pay the annual tuition of up to $500 a year and a monthly stipend to veterans who were receiving or enrolled in an educational program. And then they provided a loan guarantee for purchases of home, farm, or businesses. And the government would guarantee up to 50% of the loan and cap the interest rate at 4%, which is a very good rate. So it made home ownership much more affordable and attainable for a big swath of returning veterans. So those were the main components of the GI Bill.
It's so fascinating to hear about the role of the Legion and just how, something that started on hotel cocktail napkins is really what forms the basis of this major legislation that has impacted so many service members since its enactment. So I guess fast forwarding a little bit back to Katie, looking at August of 1945, August 15th, General Omar Bradley is put into place at the VA. And so what challenges does he face when he takes on this new position? Was he eager to take on this role? Because you're going from battlefield to now administration, and particularly medical administration. And who does he decide to partner with to make this happen?
So let me kind of back up a little bit. So you have, like I said before, you've got those 500,000 veterans who need immediate medical care, and you have 16 million veterans total coming out of World War II. And what they're facing at VA is about 100 hospitals that are spread out across the country in mostly rural areas, like I was talking about. And you also have a depleted medical workforce, right? Because the war had a lot of doctors from VA had gone on to the war and to serve there. And the doctors that were there were a little bit hampered by kind of civil service regulations and what they were able to do and what they were able to learn. So the situation is kind of bad in 1945, and the press dubs it the backwaters of medicine. So it's clear that there needs to be some sort of change, and you have this onslaught of veterans coming back needing healthcare and needing services. So what President Truman does is calls upon General Omar Bradley, his fellow Missourian, to take on this situation. Bradley has sent these men into battle. It is very personal for him to ensure that their way home is eased and taken care of. He's a little hesitant to take on the job. Remember, this is the job that FDR called the hardest job in Washington, VA administrator. So you can tell he has some trepidations about it, but really he has such loyalty to the men that he served with that he takes this role on. And he is installed as VA administrator on August 15th, and that's just one day removed from Victory over Japan Day. So he really has kind of no time to waste in taking this role on. And so he brings on immediately Dr. Paul Hawley, who was the chief surgeon in the European theater, and just personally one of my favorite figures in all of this. He is a very blunt medical administrator. You can tell he has no time to deal with any of these Washington bureaucracies. He says something like, "To hell with scenery, I need the finest hospitals," and you can really tell that he needs it now. So Bradley, Hawley, and then another VA physician, Dr. Paul Magnuson, really start to take this challenge on, even though they know it's going to be a difficult one.
Oh, definitely. Funny how some things never change in Washington either. Now, going back to the GI Bill, so did it have trouble going through Congress? And would you label it controversial, particularly with both Congress's approval and even American public opinion?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It did encounter some headwinds. The political landscape of Congress during the war was a little tricky for FDR. The Republicans had gained, he was a Democrat. Republicans gained a huge number of seats in the 1942 midterm elections, and they often made common cause with a group of conservative Democrats in the South to try to, they were concerned about blocking any extension of the New Deal. But Roosevelt and the bill's backers were able to kind of thread the needle by presenting it. This was not like a new entitlement program for all veterans. It was designed specifically for returning veterans from World War II. They had to use these benefits within a set period of time, and then they expired. It would go away. So it's kind of presented as a kind of one-time special program to help, again, the millions of returning veterans, and also be as kind of a reward for their services and sacrifices. The funny part is the one provision of the bill that's largely forgotten today, the unemployment benefits, that proved to be actually the most controversial aspect. And the fear was that, a lot of veterans would choose not to look for a job or go obtain schooling. They just, live off the government for a year. And, that was particularly a concern of some of the Southern congressmen, where you had a large number of African-American veterans, in their states. And that was a concern for them. And that almost derailed the bill kind of at the last minute, almost got stalled in committee, but they ended up kind of forging ahead and getting it passed. And then once it came out of committee, it did pass unanimously in both houses. And I think it did garner widespread public support, but there's also some uncertainty, like what exactly was this bill going to do? And that wouldn't become clear until, over a several year period where, the different provisions went into effect.
Definitely. Now, going back to Katie, so you have General Omar Bradley in place, you have Hawley in place. What are some of the proposals for change that came out of them taking the helm on the medical side of the VA?
So really, they have three major proposals that they worked through in the fall of 1945. First, they want to uncouple hiring practices from the civil service system, which would allow them to hire a younger, more innovative workforce that was more in touch with current medicine and medical practices more quickly. I believe they were, before, when they were only allowed to hire from within the civil service system, they were given a list of doctors they were able to hire that were on average over 60 years old. So they want to uncouple that. Also, they want to forge partnerships with the nation's medical schools. This would allow VA to take advantage of the research and teaching capabilities of these institutions, while also gaining more of a medical workforce that could assist veteran patients. And then lastly, their other big proposal was planning for an entire new generation of hospitals. I talked before about those Civil War hospitals that were more rural and the ones kind of following the First World War. But really, in planning this third generation of new VA hospitals, they needed ones that were closer to major population centers, right? Because that was a barrier in access to care previously for veterans. So they need them that are closer to major towns, but also the major medical schools that they're looking to partner with. So you have this whole new generation of hospitals that are being built. And Jeff noted the large sum of money that was set aside to build this hospital program. And it would be the largest proposed construction project in American history at that time. And what those would look like would be, because they're in cities now, they would be larger, more skyscraper style type buildings. And I urge everybody kind of like do some research on their own just to kind of see what these hospitals look like from each kind of generation. But those are their three main large proposals for handling healthcare for veterans after Second World War.
Absolutely. So Thinking about the return home. So the GI Bill's been passed, right, Jeff? So what are the short-term effects of the GI Bill, and how did it help veterans make this transition back into civilian life?
Okay. Well, one, the unemployment benefits did provide kind of a safety net for them. And as I said, even though there was concern that, large numbers would use it and just so they could, avoid having to look for work. In the end, only about 60% of eligible veterans ended up claiming the benefit, and they used it on average for a little under 20 weeks. So that was very successful. Education benefits, prior to World War II, college was generally attended by, Americans on the upper, middle to higher end of the economic spectrum. And the GI Bill changed that overnight and opened the doors to higher education for a much broader swath of the population. And in the end, about 1 in 8 returning veterans used the GI Bill to attend college or graduate school. The tuition payment of $500, that was sufficient to afford the tuition, even the most expensive private schools like Harvard. So the college population surged by 1947, veterans made up about 50% of the 2.3 million people enrolled in colleges, universities, and that number, that 2.3 million number, that's about 1 million more than pre-war levels. So you can see just how the influx of veterans affected the population, just increased the access to higher education. But it's also important to remember that veterans could use these benefits for what's called like sub-college education, for vocational training schools, for on-the-job training programs. And in fact, many more veterans use those education benefits and actually use it for college. About 3.5 million use it to obtain vocational or technical training. Another 1.4 million used it to receive various kinds of on-the-job training. So the net result is you not only have a better educated workforce, you have a better trained workforce and more highly skilled, and it paved the way for millions of returning vets to secure higher paying jobs as white collar or blue collar professionals. So it really helped underwrite the prosperity and productivity of post-war America. It was a real engine of social mobility and kind of climbing the economic ladder. In terms of loan guarantee, it made home ownership again possible for just a huge, much greater proportion of Americans who before it was out of reach. The VA did not actually loan veterans the money. Instead, it just guaranteed part of the loan, which made it easier for them to secure mortgages from private lenders. And by 1956, about 4.3 million VA-backed loans worth about $33 billion had been made, and just had a tremendous impact and fueled the growth of home ownership, and also just to find housing for veterans. There was a real housing shortage before the war and during the war. It led to the expansion into the suburbs. Enterprising developers turned to land that was outside the cities, that wasn't being used, that was pretty cheap to buy, and they started building planned communities outside these urban areas. And one of the first and most famous was Levittown, New York, where they built it on like 4,000 acres of farmland in Long Island. And by 1953, the community was home to 70,000 people. And it was such a success that the developer for Levittown, just look at William Levitt, built 2 more Levittowns, one in Pennsylvania and another in New Jersey. And these homes were mass produced and they were turned out quickly. And again, it made home ownership available to just larger numbers. And home ownership, as you've maybe seen in the news, is such an important engine of wealth accumulation. So it's really critical to the growth of a middle class in the United States.
Definitely so interesting to think about how this bill impacted our workforce, what we know as housing today. One of my favorite things related to the GI Bill and education is hearing some of the oral histories about college graduates who had been to college before World War II, who decided to use that money to go learn how to fly a plane. Those are some of the coolest stories that I've heard from that. So you not only got vocational training, but training in new technologies as well. So going back to the medical side of things, Katie, you had talked about proposals looking at locations and how to increase the supply of doctors. Was everyone on board with this plan? And I guess kind of like how I had asked Jeff, what was American public opinion about these changes with the VA, especially the medical side?
So most everybody is pretty on board with these changes. The press absolutely loves Bradley. He has wide support in the media and the public as well, and Congress in addition to all of that. But where they run into some problems is, again, with that bureaucracy, with that civil service that doesn't want to quite see some of those changes happen. So there's this dramatic moment on New Year's Eve in 1945 where you have this bill, the Department of Medicine and Surgery bill, which kind of encapsulates all of those changes, making its way through. And the civil service system kind of puts the brakes on it a little bit, digs in. And you have Bradley and Hawley going to Truman on New Year's Eve saying, we're going to resign if this doesn't come through. So that kind of took care of it. And after that, on January 3rd, 1946, President Truman does indeed sign the bill into law, formally creating the Department of Medicine and Surgery with VA and cementing those changes that they had proposed.
That's definitely an exciting way to spend Christmas Eve for sure. Now, looking to back to the GI Bill, we did talk about the short-term benefits of the GI Bill, but I think it's a fair question to ask: did all service members enjoy equal access to these benefits, particularly our female service members and our Black service members?
Yeah, no, that's a really important and today more relevant question than ever. The 16 million Americans who served in the war, about, there were 1 million African Americans, about 300 or so thousand women. And for women, they faced, certain types of barriers to making full use of the GI Bill. For instance, female veterans who applied for home loans, they only took into consideration if they were married, their husband's salary, their husband's income, because they were considered that their income's not necessarily going to be permanent. In terms of using the education benefits, they had to be used within just a few years of discharge, and they expired after like about 7 years. And just the benefit just kind of went away. So for women, many of them, after they got out of the service, they wanted to marry, they wanted to have children, they had to maybe support their husbands who were obtaining, enrolled in an education program. So they didn't necessarily have the opportunity right then to take advantage of those education benefits. And if they didn't, they disappeared. And there's also some unintended consequences. Because of the huge demand for admission into colleges, some colleges started to establish kind of quotas on the number of women they would admit, just so they could be able to accommodate all the male veterans. And even some women's colleges started to admit male veterans to kind of handle some of the overflow. So the net result is, women, received relatively few educational gains compared to, the male population. And in terms of African Americans, there was great hope that this would be, a great service to them. But in practice, this was the era of, the Jim Crow South, segregation and separate but equal, was kind of the rule of the land. And the majority of African American veterans did reside in the South. And so they faced all sorts of barriers and obstacles. In terms of education, only a few thousand actually enrolled in colleges in the North. And even those colleges in the North often established quotas or limits to the number of African Americans they would accept. And then in the South, they were barred completely from most white institutions. So they had no choice but to go to historically Black colleges. And the enrollments of them did, soared as a result of the GI Bill. Went from like 30-some thousand to about 74,000 by the late 1940s. But those schools, they were underfunded, under-resourced. They had a shortage of trained faculty. And even with the expansion of the number of students they could take, they still didn't have enough to keep up with the demand. So many Black veterans who did qualify, who were able to go on to college, were just turned away because there just wasn't, the Black colleges were not able to take them all, and probably tens of thousands or more probably just dissuaded from even trying. And then in terms of the other types of education benefits, on-the-job training programs, vocational schools, again, many were just for whites only, so it was very limited opportunities. And they're often shunted to more like, kind of semi-skilled training programs or lower skilled training programs, as opposed to white veterans. And then the loan guarantee, again, as I said, the VA didn't actually loan the money. Instead, they issued what considered was called like a certificate of eligibility. But then it was up to the veteran to find a private lender to make the loan. And there in the home loan industry, African Americans just faced systematic discrimination throughout the country. They had trouble obtaining loans. Many of those housing communities I just talked about, those big planned communities, they specifically had agreements that they would not sell to Black homeowners. So the overall result, and this is actually a subject that needs more thorough research, but very, very few African American soldiers were able to take advantage of the loan benefits to purchase a home. I don't know if there's any hard number that I've seen, and like I said, and I think the obstacle is more on the lender side than the VA in terms of considering them eligible for a loan. But again, that, like I said, that subject requires, I think, more research. But the big takeaway is that by being denied access to home ownership, that's, as I just said a few minutes earlier, that was a major source of wealth accumulation for Americans in the post-war era. And so that set African Americans at a huge disadvantage that we still see the effects today through income inequality. And even though, with the Fair Housing Act in 1968, it prohibited a lot of those practices, African American families were kind of too far behind to kind of catch up because they couldn't afford homes that they now were allowed to buy because they didn't have the equity built up to, to make the down payment to acquire homes. And like I said, so that's one of the legacies unfortunate legacies that we do live with today.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's an important thing to discuss related to benefits. And I guess kind of turning it back to the medical side, as a veteran, what does this change in medical care look like for you? How did hospitals change and what did they look like during this post-war period? And I guess if you're able to kind of talk as well about the experience, essentially Black service members and female service members with the VA, I think it'd be very interesting to kind of see the other side.
Absolutely. So if you're a veteran, what this means for you, once that legislation has passed in January of 1946, and once the Department of Medicine and Surgery has been established in VA, is that you're able to access care more quickly than had any other generation of veterans in the past, and different varieties of care as well. After the Civil War and after World War I, it had sort of taken a while for them to kind of build hospitals and kind of get that care going. But in 1946, once you kind of have passage of that, you see nearly 5,000 doctors, nurses, and other medical personnel being brought on to VA to provide medical care to veterans. And by the end of the decade, you have over 80 hospitals added to the VA roster, either through construction or through transfer. And within those hospitals, then you begin to see greater specializations, unlike ever before, with paraplegia, prosthetics, heart, lung, lots more specializations of care are being provided to World War II veterans. And you see virtually every medical school starts to partner with the VA, beginning with Hines Hospital and Northwestern University. So you do begin to see that academic link as well, which leads to greater research and greater innovation within those hospitals as well. And you also have the implementation of something called the Michigan Plan or the Hometown Plan, which would allow veterans to seek care and provide and gives veterans care at their local private hospital as well. So you just have more opportunities for care in the post-World War II period. For women and for African Americans, you have the origins of care for women veterans at VA starting at the end of the Second World War. While women had been eligible for medical care before, you really start to see it kick off after World War II with the first 10 female physicians hired during that time. So you really start to see a lot of specializations kind of begin in the origins of that in the post-World War II period. For African Americans, after the First World War, a exclusively African American hospital had been set up in Tuskegee, Alabama, and the VA left the issue of segregation at the local level. So a lot of northern hospitals were integrated, while a lot of hospitals in the South and the West were still segregated. And after World War II, you see calls for another segregated hospital to be built. And this is strongly opposed by the NAACP, who would rather see the integration of the entire VA hospital network, and something that unfortunately doesn't happen until 1954. So that's sort of the status for African Americans at that time.
Definitely interesting to hear that hospitals were integrated, VA medical hospitals were integrated while the armed forces were not, correct?
So some were integrated and some were segregated because they left it at that local control. There was not a national policy for that. So while some were integrated in the North, a lot in the South were not integrated. And they were fully integrated, the whole system, in 1954.
Well, that's fascinating. And so I guess to kind of close this out, Jeff, my question for you is, what's the long-term legacy of the GI Bill, and how does it apply to veterans of later conflicts as well?
Right. Well, as I said, the GI Bill was a terminal bill. It applied just to World War II veterans, and all its benefits expired after, it was modified a bit, but after about, the mid 1950s. But like any kind of like entitlement program, once you offer something to someone, it's hard to kind of take it away. And so when the Korean War broke out, initially there wasn't much interest in having a GI Bill for Korean War veterans, but as the war intensified and the US commitment grew, there was support in Congress to pass a GI Bill for service members who were serving during the Korean War era. And so a bill was passed in 1952 called, it was basically like considered the Korean conflict GI Bill. And then in 1966, during the Vietnam War, another GI Bill was passed that not only applied to veterans, serving the Vietnam War era, but also going back to 1955, from the kind of the end of the Korean War era. So for the first time, the GI Bill was being offered to veterans who served even during a time, the late 50s, when there was, the US was not really at war with anybody. So you see kind of this precedent established by the original 1944 bill of offering similar benefits to veterans of later wars. And the 52 and 66 GI Bill, the benefits were not as generous as the 1944 GI Bill. For instance, under these later bills, it was almost impossible for most veterans to afford a private school unless they had their own financial resources to do so. The bill's benefits themselves would not pay for their attendance. And then after Vietnam, when the US transitioned to an all-volunteer force, another GI Bill was passed in 1976, designed for veterans of the all-volunteer force. And the focus of the bill shifted from being like helping veterans kind of to reintegrate into society to being kind of a recruitment incentive to get people to join the military, knowing that they would qualify for these educational benefits. And for the first time, though, these benefits were not free. Service members had to actually pay into the system to kind of qualify for the benefits when they got out. It was in the early 1970s also that the loan aspects of the GI Bill were kind of detached from the GI Bill itself and became just a permanent lifetime benefit for all veterans, and so that really established that program. So kind of, there's been several more GI Bills passed since then. One of the most recent, most important is the post 9/11 GI Bill, which was one of the more generous GI Bills that, again, not quite on the level of the 1944 bill. It did make it possible for most veterans to go to any public school they wanted with all their expenses paid by the government. So overall, over the lifespan of these different GI Bills and the loan guarantee program, I think the VA has dispensed some $400 billion in benefits, education benefits to 25 million people, and has guaranteed 25 million loans worth $2.6 trillion. So again, the GI Bills just had a huge impact on successive generations of veterans, and is really kind of one of the most, popular benefits that VA offers today, and is one of the, signature benefits programs.
Absolutely. And Katie, kind of throwing it back to you, looking at the long-term effects and legacy of the Department of Medicine and Surgery within the VA, what we know is the VA medical system. Why is this worth commemorating, and how has it impacted care for successive generations of veterans?
So while you have the origins of VA medical care coming out of the Civil War, really the Department of Medicine and Surgery is the modern foundation for the VA healthcare system that we know today. So many programs and policies can be traced to the post-World War II period and the reforms that Bradley and Hawley made. From that first academic affiliation, like I was saying, nearly every medical school now is affiliated with the VA hospital. And so you have 70% of all doctors being trained in some form from VA. So not only has that impacted the care veterans have received, but it's also, chances are that a doctor or another medical personnel that you have encountered in your life has been trained at VA as well. And that by deciding to fund and expand research and innovation from those academic partnerships, we've seen so many innovations that have helped not only veterans, but the entire world as well. The CT scan, the cardiac pacemaker, the cigarette smoking patch, several Nobel Prizes have come out of that. So really it's laid the foundation that allowed all of these things to kind of take off. And it's allowed a system that could care for 9 million veterans, which is what VA cares for today. In addition to that, you have the VA voluntary service, which comes out of that, all of the volunteers in the hospital system. That's another legacy of the Department of Medicine and Surgery Act. So just quite a lot of things that came out of that time period that are a hallmark of VA care today.
Yeah, it's so interesting looking back on our discussion about how much World War II shaped what we know today with veterans benefits and veterans healthcare. And so at this point, we are going to turn it over to our audience members for their questions. So if you have any questions for Jeff or Katie, please place them either within the Q&A section on Zoom, or if you're watching through Facebook Live, place them as a comment within the video stream. Just as a reminder, if you have questions related to your eligibility or current benefits, please contact your local VA. So the first question I have is specifically for you, Katie. What was the criteria for VA hospital sites outside of just rural versus urban, especially looking at this post-World War II medical care?
It's a really good question. So in following the Civil War, a lot of those were just placed near not near large population centers, but in rural areas that could be sort of accessed by train or other sort of transportation as well. And then in the post-World War I period, you have kind of the hospitals placed sort of near some, holistic areas geographically as well, near hot springs. That was kind of like the fashion at the time. So you have the areas of the country kind of populated with hospitals that way. But you also sort of see some political patronage happening there too with hospitals, and some congressional interference of where a hospital is going to go that might not have been the most accessible for a veteran, but a win for a congressman. So that kind of changes then after the Second World War, where there really, an emphasis on those larger population centers and near those major medical schools. So you see, hospitals in Ann Arbor, and you see hospitals just kind of follow where the medical schools are and things like that.
Definitely. So a question for both of you guys. We talked a little bit about the experience of Black service members and female service members related to these benefits in medical care. Do you guys have any information related to Hispanic Americans or Asian Americans and whether or not they faced discrimination immediately after the war related to the GI Bill and to VA medical care?
Yeah, that's a good question. In terms of Hispanics, VA didn't really track that because Hispanics were classified as whites. So I don't know if there's any statistics that, that you could draw upon. I feel, it's more likely they face kind of informal types of discrimination versus opposed to kind of, statutory discrimination that African-Americans face in the South. So it was more like, maybe difficulty getting into schools or being dissuaded from applying to some schools or obtaining some types of job benefits. In terms of Asian, I don't think they did. I mean, because, you had the internment of the Japanese Americans, during the war, but after that, I think returning veterans who, performed, so heroically and had, such an amazing record of achievement during the war, I think they were able to use the GI Bill without much of any, hindrance.
Yeah, and I would go along with what Jeff has said too on the medical side. I think, on that more statutory side, you have discrimination against African Americans, but not so much as I've seen with Asian Americans and with Hispanic Americans. It might have been on a different level, on a little bit more subtle level, but not quite on the level that African Americans were discriminated against.
Absolutely. And I guess just to piggyback off of that, to encourage our audience members to tune in for future programming and to go back to some of our previous programs. We recently covered the experience of Asian Americans prolifically this past spring, and we do have an upcoming webinar looking at the experience of Mexican Americans in post-war World War II, so the late 40s, coming up in September. Now, for the next question for Dr. Sykin, does the GI Bill help pay for family members' education? I guess to reframe that, did it pay for family members' education during World War II, or is it exclusively for the use of the service?
Yeah, that's a good question. The original GI Bill was exclusively for service members, and in fact, Gold Star widows petitioned Congress to allow them to draw on some of the GI Bill benefits, and they were turned down initially. Eventually, the law was changed so that widows and dependent family members could use the GI Bill benefits, but that came later on in the process. And the laws were also changed to allow actually service members while they're on active duty to use the loan guarantee benefits and the education benefits, but that came later on in the 70s and 80s.
Absolutely. So Katie, can you address mental health care in the immediate post-World War II era? Was there any lessening of stigmas related to mental health, or was it just not really addressed at that point?
Absolutely. That's a great question. So again, that's kind of mental health as an issue that's kind of evolved from the Civil War onwards in terms of VA medical care. And it's something that's existed, the entire time that there has been war, but it's only been kind of more recently that it's been addressed in a medical capacity. So you had some of these holistic approaches following the end of the Civil War, and you had just the very nature of the structures were sort of a element to addressing kind of some of that mental health. So veterans who didn't really kind of want to be a part of society could be in one of these homes with other soldiers who kind of understood what they were going through and kind of live through that together. And then, after the end of the First World War, you had what was termed shell shock, and you had at least sort of that kind of identified as more of an issue. And so then after the end of the Second World War, mental health is something that Paul Hawley is very passionate about. And so you have psychology and a lot of other mental health programs coming out of the Second World War as well. And that's definitely not as stigmatized anymore. And it definitely grows as its own sort of profession and field within VA at that time. So very good question.
Definitely. So Jeff, this one's for you. What efforts were made to inform World War II veterans of the benefits available to them?
Yeah, well, since the GI Bill passed in June of 1944, that was, a good almost a year before the war in Europe ended, and the war, against Japan continued to August 1945. So it gave VA just plenty of time to kind of spread the word about the benefits. So they printed up, all sorts of pamphlets that were distributed to service members. Within the military, they held, kind of like counseling sessions to inform service members of the different benefits programs. So a great effort was made to kind of get the word out and to educate, military personnel about these new benefit programs that would be available to them when they got out of the service. They also printed out promotional materials, posters and such that they plastered over the walls of barracks and things, so again, just every different ways were made to, to inform people, to inform the military personnel.
Absolutely. And I agree with you. That lead time definitely did help with the end of the war, about a year out. So Katie, are there any resources or publications you can recommend for folks to learn more about the VA hospitals and the programs that were developed for World War II veterans?
Absolutely. So there's a great congressional publication called Medical Care for Veterans that came out in, I believe, the 70s or the 80s. It's a very informative source, but it's a little dry. It's a little bit more in depth. But I highly recommend Dr. Michael Gambone's book, The Greatest Generation Comes Home, all about how servicemen readjusted after the end of the Second World War. And also Omar Bradley's memoir itself is a great resource. So I highly recommend those.
Absolutely. And same to you, Jeff. Do you have any resources or recommendations for folks to learn more?
Yes. A book I strongly recommend is called The GI Bill, A New Deal for Veterans by Glenn Altshuler and Stuart Blumen. It came out a few years ago and does just a really good idea of trying to incorporate all the latest scholarship on the GI Bill and the various ways it was implemented and its effects on different segments of veterans. And then if you're interested in learning more about maybe the legacy of the GI Bill, there's a good book. Let me just pull it aside. It's called Failing Our Veterans, the GI Bill in the Vietnam Generation by Mark Bolton, and talks about some of the shortcomings of the 1966 GI Bill and why Vietnam veterans felt that they weren't really getting the same due as World War II era veterans.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Katie and Jeff, for joining us today. I thoroughly enjoyed this discussion, and I believe that our audience did as well.
All right. Well, again, it was our pleasure to be here. Thank you for hosting us.
Absolutely.
Yes. Thanks, Maggie. Thanks, everybody.
Definitely. So if you enjoyed today's program, continue to stay up to date with upcoming programs from the National World War II Museum by liking our Facebook page and visiting our website. And as always, we thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you guys next time here at the National World War II Museum.